In June of 1978, while tens of thousands of Argentine citizens were being tortured and executed by their own government in secret detention centers scattered across Buenos Aires, the city hosted one of the most celebrated sporting events on earth. The crowds were enormous. The stadiums were full. The television cameras broadcast the matches to 600 million people worldwide. And less than 1 mile from the Estadio Monumental, where Argentina would go on to win its first World Cup title, the Navy School of Mechanics had been converted into one of the most brutal torture facilities in the history of the Western Hemisphere. It was fully operational. Prisoners held there later testified that on the night Argentina defeated the Netherlands in the final, they could hear the roar of the crowd from their cells. That detail has stayed in the public record for over 40 years. It has never lost its power to disturb. Not because political violence and sport are rare companions in history, but because of the geometry. 1 kilometer, a stadium full of confetti, noise, and 600 million people watching at home on one side, cells and darkness on the other, and the cameras pointed, without exception, toward the light. This video is about 5 World Cups: Argentina in 1978, South Africa in 2010, Brazil in 2014, Russia in 2018, Qatar in 2022. 5 countries, 5 political systems, 5 different decades, and in each case the same essential negotiation took place. A government agreed to absorb costs it could never honestly justify to its own citizens in exchange for a global spectacle that could be used for purposes that had nothing to do with sport. Sometimes that meant hiding a massacre. Sometimes it meant hiding a debt. Sometimes it meant hiding both at once. The total bill across those 5 tournaments, absorbed almost entirely by citizens who were never honestly told what they were agreeing to, runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The games were real. The corruption beneath them was also real. And the structure that made both possible is still running right now. Argentina, the laboratory of fear. To understand what the Argentine junta was doing in 1978, you need to understand what they were afraid of. The military had seized power in March 1976, 18 months before FIFA was scheduled to arrive. General Jorge Rafael Videla led a government that was, from its first days in power, engaged in systematic mass murder. They called it the process of national reorganization. Human rights organizations and historians call it the Dirty War. Between 1976 and 1983, an estimated 30,000 people were disappeared by the Argentine state, kidnapped from their homes and workplaces, tortured in clandestine detention centers, and in many cases killed and dropped from military aircraft into the Rio de la Plata or the South Atlantic Ocean. Their bodies were never recovered. Their families were never told what had happened to them. By 1977, this was becoming a problem. Not a moral problem from the junta's perspective, a diplomatic one. Human rights organizations in Europe and the United States were documenting the disappearances. Exile groups were reaching foreign journalists. The Carter administration in Washington had begun publicly pressing Argentina on its human rights record. Amnesty International had published a damning report. The international narrative around Argentina was starting to coalesce around a word the junta found extremely inconvenient: genocide. The World Cup was scheduled for June 1978. 60 countries would send journalists. 600 million people would watch. And the junta realized, with unusual clarity, that they were about to receive the most powerful piece of international media coverage in years, at precisely the moment they could least afford scrutiny. They chose to use it. Admiral Carlos Lacoste, appointed to run the organizing committee, was not selected for his expertise in sports administration. He was selected because he could be trusted. The construction contracts that followed were not awarded on merit. The tournament's final price tag was roughly 7 times the original estimate, with much of the difference flowing into companies with direct connections to junta officials. Lacoste himself fled Argentina after the government fell and spent years abroad to avoid prosecution. But the financial corruption was almost secondary to the real architecture of Argentina in 1978, which was not built in stadiums. It was built in mines. Foreign journalists who arrived to cover the tournament were met at the airport by official government representatives who denied that any systematic human rights violations were occurring. A right-wing paramilitary group had published lists of journalists and activists targeted for violence, and several correspondents covering the tournament received personal threats. The atmosphere was not one that encouraged going off script. Johan Cruyff would have been the defining player of that World Cup. He was the most important Dutch footballer of his generation, possibly of his entire era, and the Netherlands were among the favorites to win. Cruyff declined to travel. His official explanation at the time cited personal reasons. Decades later, he clarified that his decision was in part a deliberate refusal to participate in a tournament organized by a government engaged in mass political violence. The Dutch team made the final without him. The man who could have been the face of that World Cup chose, quietly and at personal cost, not to be there. While the matches were being played, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo were marching. They had started in April 1977, more than a year before the World Cup. Every Thursday, they walked in circles around the plaza directly in front of the Casa Rosada, Argentina's presidential palace, carrying photographs of their disappeared children and demanding information. The junta called them Las Madres Locas, the crazy mothers, hoping the label would discredit them. It did not. The cameras that covered the tournament, however, did not find their way to the plaza. And then there was the match against Peru. On June 21st, in the second-round group stage, Argentina faced Peru, needing to win by at least 4 goals to advance to the final ahead of Brazil on goal difference. Argentina won 6-0 against a Peruvian team that had performed competently throughout the tournament. Their goalkeeper, Ramon Quiroga, had been born in Argentina. The margin generated immediate suspicion, and the suspicion never fully went away. In the years that followed, multiple sources, including a former member of the junta itself, alleged that the Videla government had struck a private arrangement with Peru's military government. In exchange for a cooperative performance on the pitch, Argentina allegedly shipped 35,000 tons of grain to Peru and released a number of Peruvian political prisoners held in Argentine jails. These allegations have never been proven in court. They have also never been definitively disproven. Peruvian players from that match denied any wrongdoing. The 6-0 scoreline has never been satisfactorily explained. What has been documented through declassified American government records is that Henry Kissinger, the former U.S. Secretary of State, visited Argentina before the tournament and met with Videla. Kissinger reportedly told the Argentine foreign minister that the Carter administration's public human rights stance did not fully represent the private American position. Whether that conversation shaped anything that happened on the pitch is impossible to establish. What it establishes is the degree to which this tournament was embedded in a global diplomatic context that had nothing to do with football. On the night of June 25th, Argentina defeated the Netherlands 3-1 in a stadium full of ticker tape so dense it briefly made the pitch invisible. The crowd noise could be heard for miles. At the Navy School of Mechanics, 1 kilometer away, the lights were on. Argentina would spend the next several years maintaining the fiction that nothing had happened. The truth emerged slowly, through survivor testimony after the junta fell, through the criminal trials that followed, through decades of investigation by journalists and human rights organizations. ESMO is now a museum of memory. The 30,000 are counted, named, mourned. But in June 1978, none of that had happened yet. The tournament had worked. The cameras had left. The international conversation had shifted, at least temporarily, from disappearances to goal difference. The junta had thought carefully about the international press. They understood that a blanket crackdown on foreign journalists would itself become a story. So they chose a more sophisticated approach: access, managed tightly. Reporters who asked uncomfortable questions found their accreditation suddenly complicated. Those who stuck to football found every door open. The result was that the international coverage of Argentina in 1978 was, for the most part, exactly what the junta had ordered: images of a passionate, celebratory nation unified by sport. The atrocities happening 1 kilometer from the stadium were not a secret to everyone, but they were not on camera. And in 1978, if something was not on camera, it did not exist for the hundreds of millions watching at home. The night Argentina won the final, the streets of Buenos Aires erupted in celebrations that were entirely genuine. People who had lived through 2 years of disappearances and fear poured into the streets and screamed and embraced each other. This is one of the most disturbing elements of the whole episode. The joy was real. The people were not pretending. They had been told a story about Argentina, and the World Cup was the evidence for that story, and many of them believed it. The junta had understood something true, that a country desperate to believe something positive about itself will find reasons to believe, even when the evidence against it is 1 kilometer away. Every government that hosted a World Cup after 1978 was operating in the knowledge that this had been possible. Not all of them needed to hide a genocide, but all of them understood at some level what a global sporting event could do for an inconvenient story. What South Africa discovered 3 decades later is that you do not need to be hiding a crime to pay a price you were never honestly told about. South Africa, 2010, The Price of a Dream. In July 2004, when FIFA announced that the 2010 World Cup would be held in South Africa, millions of people cried. This is worth saying plainly, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. The joy was not manufactured. South Africa had ended apartheid only 10 years earlier. It had held its first free elections in 1994. It had spent the decade since navigating the extraordinary difficulty of building a functional multiracial democracy on the ruins of one of the most sophisticated systems of racial oppression in modern history. The World Cup was, for many South Africans, a form of global recognition, proof that the country they were trying to build was real, was visible, was worthy of standing on the world's biggest stage. Nelson Mandela described it as a dream come true. The dream came with a price tag that no one mentioned at the announcement. South Africa's initial estimate for hosting costs was approximately $300 million. The final cost was closer to $10 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is the original number multiplied by 33. In a country where 1 in 4 people was unemployed, where public hospitals were chronically under-resourced, and where a generation of Black South Africans were still waiting for the educational and economic opportunities that apartheid had systematically denied them, the government had committed public money on a scale that had never been honestly presented to the people who would pay for it. FIFA's requirements had a great deal to do with that gap. The organization demanded new stadiums in multiple cities, rather than renovated facilities that could have been upgraded for a fraction of the cost. The Cape Town Stadium became the most visible symbol of what that requirement meant in practice. It was a genuinely beautiful building, a curved, luminous structure on the Atlantic waterfront designed by a German architecture firm, completed at a cost of approximately $600 million. It held 68,000 people. After the tournament, the local professional soccer club that was supposed to anchor, it looked at the ongoing operating costs and decided to keep playing at a smaller, cheaper venue elsewhere in the city. The Cape Town Stadium needed approximately $4 million per year just to maintain itself. It hosted concerts, some rugby, occasional soccer. It became what economists call a white elephant, a structure too expensive to use and too visible to demolish, a monument to a financial calculation that was wrong from the moment it was approved. Nelspruit, Polokwane, Port Elizabeth, the same story in different cities. Stadiums built to FIFA specifications that made sense for a global tournament, indefensible for the local economies that inherited them. The crowds after the World Cup were a fraction of installed capacity. The operating subsidies continued. South African taxpayers absorbed them. FIFA, meanwhile, collected approximately $4 billion in broadcasting and commercial rights revenue from the 2010 tournament. South Africa received a small fraction of that. The country that spent $10 billion to make the event possible walked away with a revenue share that bore no mathematical relationship to its costs. And those billions arrived tax-free, because the host city agreements that South Africa's government had signed exempted FIFA and its commercial partners from South African taxation. A government that had built its legitimacy on redressing economic injustice had agreed to terms that, in the plainest possible language, transferred wealth from South African taxpayers to a Swiss-registered private organization. The corruption layer, when it was eventually exposed, completed the picture. Danny Jordan, the chief executive of the 2010 organizing committee, was accused by a former FIFA official of authorizing a $10 million payment to a foundation controlled by Jack Warner, the CONCACAF president, who would later be indicted by American federal prosecutors on multiple corruption charges. Jordan denied the accusation. FIFA described the payment as a legitimate diaspora development program. American prosecutors described it as a bribe connected to the South Africa hosting vote. Sepp Blatter, who was FIFA's president at the time, later acknowledged receiving a separate $1 million payment connected to the South Africa tournament. He called it a legitimate bonus. FIFA's ethics committee called it grounds for a multi-year ban from the sport. The promises made to justify the tournament proved approximately as reliable as the original cost estimate. 500,000 foreign visitors? The actual number was significantly lower, 400,000 jobs. Disputed by independent economists who noted that most construction work was temporary and that permanent employment from legacy infrastructure was a fraction of what had been projected. $3 billion in economic activity, not independently verified by anyone not hired by the organizing committee. What South Africa was left with, a decade after the final, was a maintenance bill it had not budgeted for, stadiums it could not fill, and the memory of a genuine moment of national pride that had been converted into a financial obligation that could not honestly be justified on economic terms. The dream, it turned out, had been rented, and the bill arrived years after the cameras left. The economists who produced the original $300 million estimate had, in the most charitable reading, simply not accounted for the real cost of meeting FIFA's requirements. In a less charitable reading, the estimate was produced to be politically useful rather than accurate. Either way, the gap between the number presented to South Africans before the tournament was awarded and the number on the final invoice afterward was the gap between a decision a democratic public might have considered carefully and a decision made before the full price was visible. What $10 billion could have purchased instead occupied South African economic commentary for years after the tournament. Independent analyses suggested it was roughly equivalent to the backlog in the country's school infrastructure, or several years of the National Health Department's budget for medicines and medical equipment. These are not abstract comparisons. In the years following the World Cup, South African schools continued to run double sessions. Public hospitals continued to report critical shortages of basic supplies. The stadiums that had been built instead of those things stood, beautiful and underused, on waterfronts and in city centers across the country. If South Africa showed what a government pays when it believes the promises, Brazil showed what happens when the people stop believing them. Brazil, 2014. When the street said no picture, 1 million people in the streets of São Paulo on a Tuesday night in June, not marching toward a stadium, marching away from one. This is where Brazil's World Cup story actually begins, not in a boardroom in Zurich where the bid was awarded, not in the glass offices where the construction contracts were signed, but in the street, in the noise, in the year before the tournament, when more Brazilians took to the streets simultaneously than at any moment since the movement that had ended the military dictatorship. It started with bus fares. The city of São Paulo announced a 20-centavo increase in the cost of a bus ticket. A left-wing social movement called the Free Fare Movement organized a small protest, a few hundred people. The police response was disproportionate. Tear gas and rubber bullets against a crowd angry about the cost of getting to work. The images circulated rapidly on social media. The protest was not about bus fares anymore. Within 2 weeks, the demonstrations had expanded to more than 100 Brazilian cities. The chant that defined what followed was blunt and direct. Não vai ter Copa. There will be no cup. The people saying it were not anti-football. Brazil is not a country where hostility to the sport is a coherent political position for most of the population. What the protesters were against was something more specific: the allocation of $15 billion of public resources toward infrastructure designed to satisfy FIFA's technical requirements in a country where schools ran double shifts because there were not enough classrooms, where public hospitals operated without basic supplies, where the mass transit systems of the largest cities in South America were inadequate by any reasonable standard. The government's original estimate for hosting costs had been approximately $1.1 billion. The final cost was approximately $15 billion. No one had honestly told the Brazilian public that the number would grow by a factor of 14 before the tournament was over. The arena, Amazonia in Manaus, is the evidence made concrete. Manaus is a city of 2 million people in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, accessible from the rest of Brazil primarily by river and by air. Building a 60,000-seat FIFA-certified stadium, there required transporting construction materials across thousands of kilometers of jungle. It cost approximately $300 million. The stadium hosted 4 group stage matches: Colombia versus Greece, England versus Italy, United States versus Portugal, Cameroon versus Croatia. None involving Brazil, none involving teams with any geographic connection to the Amazon whatsoever. After the tournament, the Arena Amazonia became the home of a local club playing in Brazil's 4th professional division in front of crowds that sometimes numbered in the hundreds, in a stadium built for 60,000, in Cuiabá, in Natal, in Brasília. Versions of the same calculation played out. The Estadio Nacional in Brasília cost approximately $900 million. At the time of the tournament, Brasília had no professional soccer club competing at a level that could sustainably fill it. The city was chosen as a host city because it was the capital, not because its sporting economy justified the investment. The cup happened anyway. The protesters were right about everything except the outcome. Dilma Rousseff, who had championed the hosting decision and whose government had overseen the spending, found herself defending costs that the streets had already decided were indefensible. Her initial response was to suggest that the protesters did not understand the complexity of the economic analysis. The demonstrations grew larger. And then, years later, the confirmation arrived. The Lava Jato investigation, which expanded from a money laundering inquiry in 2014 into one of the largest anti-corruption prosecutions in Latin American history, documented a systematic cartel among the major Brazilian construction companies that received public infrastructure contracts. They fixed prices. They paid bribes to politicians and political parties. They distributed a percentage of inflated contract values into slush funds that financed campaigns and personal enrichment. The executives of Odebrecht, one of the largest construction firms in the hemisphere, eventually pleaded guilty and described the system in detail. Whether the specific World Cup stadium contracts were explicitly part of the Lava Jato scheme was never definitively established in proceedings focused solely on stadium construction. What was established is this: the companies that built the stadiums were simultaneously systematically corrupting Brazilian public procurement across multiple sectors at a scale that eventually sent a former president to prison. They did not operate differently for the World Cup than they did for everything else. The street had been right. The evidence had just taken years to arrive. The 8 workers who died deserve more than a sentence. They died in construction accidents at stadiums in Sao Paulo, Manaus, Belo Horizonte, and other host cities. They were killed by falls, by electrical faults, by the kinds of accidents that become statistically predictable when construction timelines are compressed by contractual pressure. The Brazilian government and the construction companies expressed regret. FIFA expressed regret. No structural accountability followed. The stadiums were built on schedule. The tournament began. In the years after Lava Jato, Several of the construction executives who had enriched themselves through the inflated stadium contracts went to prison. The companies they had led were fined billions of dollars. Some cooperated with prosecutors and testified about the mechanics of the scheme in extraordinary detail, producing one of the most comprehensive public records of systematic corruption in the history of major public procurement. The Brazilian state had, at enormous effort and political cost, documented exactly what had been done to it. The documentation existed, the convictions were real, and the stadiums in Manaus and Brasilia and Natal remained, exactly as before, monuments to the money that had been spent on them. But if the Brazilian protesters had a voice and a vote, what followed in Russia and Qatar was a study in what happens when neither of those things is available. Russia 2018, The Optics of Power. On the 4th of March 2018, a former Russian military intelligence officer named Sergei Skripal was found unconscious on a park bench in Salisbury, England. He and his daughter had been poisoned with Novichok, a nerve agent developed by the Soviet military and maintained by the Russian state. British investigators traced the attack to two officers of the GRU, Russian military intelligence. The Russian government denied any involvement. 3 months later, Vladimir Putin sat in the presidential box at the Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow and watched Russia defeat Saudi Arabia 5-0 in the opening match of the 2018 FIFA World Cup. The juxtaposition is not incidental, it is the mechanism. Russia's World Cup was, from the perspective of pure event management, well executed. The stadiums were completed on time. Transportation worked. The security operation was extensive and, for most visitors, largely invisible. The tournament itself was widely praised. Entertaining matches, good atmospheres, an unexpected Russian run to the quarterfinals that generated genuine home support. People who went reported positive experiences. This is not beside the point. It is the whole point. Because when visiting fans are genuinely happy, when the broadcasts are clean and the logistics run smoothly, the criticism of the structural conditions under which the tournament was awarded becomes much harder to sustain in the public conversation. The World Cup works as a political instrument only if it also works as a World Cup. Putin understood this better than almost any leader who had hosted the event before him. The context in which the 2018 tournament took place was as follows. Russia had annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. Russian-backed forces were fighting an ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. Multiple Western intelligence services had documented Russian interference in the 2016 American presidential election. The Salisbury poisoning had occurred in March of the tournament year. Western governments had imposed sanctions. Relations between Russia and the NATO alliance were at their lowest point since the Cold War. This is what the cameras were supposed to be not watching for 4 weeks in June and July. Putin appeared in them, smiling, alongside the FIFA president, alongside team coaches, alongside the foreign heads of state who arrived for the later rounds. He was positioned in every frame as a host, not as the subject of active international investigations into assassination attempts on British soil, not as the leader of a country under economic sanctions for territorial annexation, as a host, gracious, calm, confident. The Russian state's relationship to sporting integrity had already been publicly established before a single match was played. The McLaren Report, commissioned by the World Anti-Doping Agency and published in 2016, documented a state-sponsored doping program that had corrupted multiple international competitions, including the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, which Russia had also hosted. The program was not the work of rogue coaches or individual athletes. It was coordinated by the FSB, Russia's domestic intelligence service. The specific mechanism involved a hole cut through the wall of the Sochi anti-doping laboratory, through which clean urine samples were substituted for contaminated ones in the middle of the night during the Games. The FSB had developed a specialized container with a loosened lid that could be opened from outside without visible damage. This was a state operation running during an international event Russia hosted. The International Olympic Committee's response was to ban Russia from the 2018 Winter Olympics under its national flag, while allowing individual athletes with clean records to compete under a neutral designation. FIFA's response was to proceed with the World Cup as if the report applied to a different country. There was no formal FIFA investigation into whether Russian football had been contaminated by the same state-sponsored program that had corrupted Russian Olympic sport. Russian players competed as Russians. The question of whether the country hosting the world's most-watched sporting event had recently been running a national-level cheating operation coordinated by its intelligence services was not considered relevant to FIFA's scheduling. Russia's official cost for the tournament was approximately $11 billion. Independent analysts who accounted for infrastructure spending, classified under other budget categories, put the number significantly higher. Precise figures were not available for external review. Russian government procurement processes are not designed for external review. The Mordovia Arena in Saransk is the relevant illustration. Saransk is a city of 300,000 people in a republic 500 kilometers east of Moscow. The stadium held 44,000 people. The local professional club played in Russia's second division in front of average crowds of around 2,000. After the tournament, the club was relegated. The stadium, built at a cost of approximately $300 million, continued to sit in a city where professional soccer, by any measure of local demand, did not require 44,000 seats. The Kaliningrad Stadium, built on a Baltic island separated from the Russian mainland by two countries, cost around $300 million and hosted 4 group stage games. Its subsequent history as a major venue has been limited. These were not planning failures. They were predictable consequences of building stadiums to satisfy FIFA's requirements for a global tournament, in cities selected for geographic and political reasons rather than sporting economics. FIFA needed stadiums across Russia's vast territory to make the broadcast look like a national event. Russia needed FIFA's presence to make the country look like a normal member of the international community. Both got what they needed. Russia got from the 2018 World Cup approximately what it had paid for. 4 weeks in which the world watched football instead of Crimea, instead of Salisbury, instead of Eastern Ukraine. The cameras moved on. The sanctions remained. But the image of Putin in the presidential box, smiling beside the FIFA president, was now part of the archive. The sophistication of Putin's media management during the tournament extended beyond his own public appearances. Russian hospitality toward foreign visitors was notably generous in ways that appeared carefully calibrated. Journalists who had expected bureaucratic obstruction reported relatively smooth operations. The national team's unexpected run into the quarterfinals, eliminated only on penalty kicks by Croatia, generated a wave of domestic enthusiasm that was impossible to fully distinguish from the political management around it. The coverage that emerged from the tournament was, in aggregate, considerably more positive about Russia than the coverage that had existed 3 months before, when a nerve agent attack on British soil was the dominant story. This was not an accident. It was the investment returning its dividend. Qatar would take this logic further than anyone had thought possible, and it would cost more than anyone had thought conceivable. Qatar 2022, built on silence. The summer construction season in Qatar begins in April and runs through October. During those months, the temperature regularly exceeds 45 degrees Celsius. In peak summer, it reaches 50 or above. Building materials left in direct sunlight become too hot to touch with bare hands. Working outdoors for extended periods in those conditions creates a documented medical risk of heat stroke, organ failure, and cardiac events. Between 2010, when Qatar was awarded the World Cup, and 2020, an estimated 6,500 workers from 5 South Asian countries died in Qatar. That number comes from an investigation by The Guardian newspaper using publicly available mortality data from Nepal, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. The Qatari government disputed the methodology. FIFA said that labor conditions in Qatar were not FIFA's responsibility. The construction continued. Most of the workers who came to Qatar were young men from rural areas in Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. They paid recruitment fees that, in many cases, represented more than a year of their family's income at home. They borrowed money from relatives and moneylenders to cover those fees. They arrived in Qatar under a system called kafala, which tied their legal status in the country directly to their employer. Under kafala, they could not change jobs without employer permission. They could not leave the country without employer permission. Their passports were frequently confiscated upon arrival, a practice illegal under Qatari law and documented as common by human rights investigators. Workers who attempted to leave without authorization could be prosecuted for absconding. This system was not invented for the World Cup. It was Qatar's existing legal framework for labor, built over decades for an economy that required imported workers in enormous numbers because Qatar's citizen population, approximately 300,000 people, was far too small to staff the infrastructure that the country's oil and gas revenues were building. What the World Cup did was expose that system to an international audience that would not otherwise have been watching and create a political context in which Qatar had at least some incentive to respond to criticism it would normally have had no reason to address. Workers who died were frequently classified in official Qatari records as deaths from natural causes or cardiac events. Human rights investigators noted that this category disproportionately included healthy young men in their 20s and 30s, with no prior documented cardiac history, working outdoors in extreme heat. Heat stress is a well-documented cause of cardiac events in otherwise healthy people. The Qatari system of death classification did not, as a general practice, examine whether heat exposure contributed to the deaths of construction workers who had been laboring in those conditions. The families of those workers received, in most cases, nothing. Qatari labor law did not require employers to compensate families for workplace deaths under most circumstances. A worker who had borrowed the equivalent of 12 months' wages to pay a recruitment fee, then died 3 months into the job, left his family with the debt and without the remittances. That was not an accident of the system. It was how the system was designed. The corruption around Qatar's bid added a dimension that was, in some ways, easier to document than the deaths. Mohammed bin Hammam, a Qatari football official who had served on FIFA's executive committee, was found by FIFA investigators to have made cash payments to officials from multiple national associations connected to the hosting vote. Bin Hammam was banned from football for life. Qatar's hosting rights were not rescinded. FIFA's position was that individual misconduct could not be attributed to the National Bid Committee as a whole. The cost of the tournament was extraordinary, even by the standards of what had come before. Official Qatari government figures put spending between $200 and $220 billion, though the government argued that much of this was general infrastructure that would have been built regardless. Independent analysts noted that Qatar's total GDP at the time was approximately $180 billion per year. The country had effectively committed more than its entire annual economic output to a 29-day tournament. Unlike South Africa or Brazil, Qatar had the financial resources to do this without creating a debt crisis. Its sovereign wealth fund, built from decades of liquefied natural gas revenues, is one of the largest in the world. The spending was not, at its core, about football. Saudi Arabia's investments in golf and boxing and European soccer clubs, the UAE's ownership of Manchester City and other clubs, Qatar's ownership of Paris Saint-Germain through its sovereign wealth fund. These investments share a common logic. Sport generates coverage that is not about politics. It places national leaders alongside globally celebrated athletes in images that circulate without commentary. It creates a narrative of cultural participation and international normality that runs alongside and partially displaces reporting on governance that would otherwise receive more scrutiny. The academic and journalistic term for this is sportswashing. It describes the deliberate use of sport to improve the international image of a government that has a record it prefers not to have examined directly. Qatar announced labor reforms in 2019 and 2020, elimination of the exit visa requirement that prevented workers from leaving without employer permission, a minimum wage applicable to all workers regardless of nationality, and reforms to the employer transfer process. These reforms changed the formal legal framework in ways that were real. Their implementation was documented as uneven by the same organizations that had reported the original abuses. The gap between what the laws said and what workers in Qatar actually experienced in practice remained significant, by most accounts, through the tournament itself. FIFA's position, maintained consistently through the Qatar cycle, was that labor conditions in Qatar were the responsibility of the Qatari government and that FIFA's obligations extended to the practices of direct contractors on FIFA-designated projects, not to Qatar's broader labor market. This position was legally defensible. It was also a way of defining FIFA's responsibility so narrowly that the workers whose labor built the venues FIFA used fell outside the scope of what FIFA was willing to consider its problem. The 2022 World Cup final was watched by over 1 billion people simultaneously. Lionel Messi won the one major trophy that had eluded him throughout his career. The match was exceptional. The moment was genuine. The workers who built the stadium where he lifted the trophy were represented in the broadcast that reached those billion people by approximately 0 seconds of coverage. The debt cycle that the kafala system enabled is worth understanding specifically. because it explains why so many workers remained in conditions that were documentably dangerous. A worker who had borrowed 18 months of wages at high interest to pay recruitment fees did not have the option of simply leaving Qatar when conditions proved worse than the recruiter had described. Leaving meant abandoning the income he needed to repay the debt. A worker in debt bondage is not a worker making free choices about his labor. He is a person trapped by a financial arrangement that was structured by the labor recruiters and the employers who use them to create precisely that trap. The kafala system did not merely fail to protect workers from exploitation. In its interaction with the recruitment fee structure, it actively facilitated the exploitation. This was not a side effect. It was a feature. The Qatari government's labor reforms, which were real and meaningful in their formal provisions, did not substantially address the recruitment fee problem. Workers continued to arrive in Qatar, having paid fees they could not afford from savings. The debt remained the mechanism of control. Changing the laws about employer transfers while leaving the debt structure intact meant that workers had, in theory, the right to leave one employer for another, but in practice remained bound by the same financial logic that had always made departure risky. The organizations that documented this pattern before the reforms documented the same pattern after them. The tournament went forward. The machine behind the game. The financial structure that produced these 5 outcomes is not complicated, though it is rarely stated plainly in the conversations that precede any World Cup hosting decision. FIFA does not build stadiums. FIFA does not build airports, highways, rail links, or mass transit. FIFA does not hire construction workers, pay for security, or absorb the cost of infrastructure that will need to be maintained for decades after the tournament ends. What FIFA does is set the technical requirements that the host country must meet, collect the broadcasting and commercial rights revenue that the tournament generates, pay the host a fraction of that revenue, and leave. The gap between what FIFA earns and what governments spend has never been close to 1-to-1. In South Africa, the government spent roughly $10 billion, while FIFA collected approximately $4 billion in revenue, of which South Africa received a small fraction. In Brazil, $15 billion spent against a similar FIFA take. In Qatar, $200 billion or more spent against FIFA revenue of approximately $7 billion. The entity that established the requirements and controlled the commercial rights made a substantial profit. The entities that agreed to meet those requirements paid the rest of the bill. Why do governments agree to these terms? Because hosting a World Cup generates things that cannot be captured in an accounting statement. For an authoritarian government, it generates international legitimacy at a moment when legitimacy is scarce. For a democracy facing difficult domestic conditions, it generates national unity and a temporary redirection of public attention. For any government, it produces a few weeks at the center of the world's attention in a context that is almost entirely positive because the cameras are pointed at athletes, not at ministers. The calculation is not, can we afford this? The calculation is, by the time the public fully understands what this cost, will that reckoning arrive before or after the tournament? In 5 of the most significant hosting decisions of the past 5 decades, the answer was after. The tournaments happened. The bills arrived. The conversation moved on. Brazil was the exception, or tried to be. 1 million people in the streets before the tournament, demanding accountability for spending that was still ongoing, remains one of the most significant acts of pre-tournament public opposition in World Cup history. The protesters were right about the corruption, right about the waste, right about the broken promises. What they could not stop was the momentum of an international commitment that had been signed years before they took to the streets. Lava Jato eventually confirmed what they had suspected. The executives went to prison. The stadiums remained. 5 cities, 1 story. In 1978, the cameras in Buenos Aires looked away from SMA toward the Estadio Monumental, and 30,000 people disappeared from the official record of that tournament. In 2010, the cameras in Cape Town looked toward a beautiful waterfront stadium, and $10 billion of public money vanished from the conversation about what post-apartheid South Africa needed most. In 2014, the cameras in Manaus filmed 60,000 empty seats and described it as infrastructure. In 2018, the cameras in Moscow were watching football, while 3 months earlier on a park bench in England, a Russian intelligence operation had deployed a weapons-grade nerve agent against a British citizen on British soil. In 2022, the cameras in Lusail Stadium broadcast to 3 billion people, while the families of 6,500 dead workers were trying to service debts their relatives had borrowed to travel to a country that classified their deaths as natural causes. These are not separate stories. They are the same story, told in different languages, at different scales, across 5 decades. A pattern so consistent that it cannot be explained as accident or incompetence. It is a structure, and the structure produces predictable results. The games are real. The athletes are not responsible for what their tournaments are built inside. The joy of the sport is genuine and worth protecting precisely because it is genuine. 2 billion people watching a World Cup final are not wrong to be watching it. The football is worth watching, but underneath that joy, in every one of these 5 cases, was a financial arrangement in which governments absorbed costs they could never honestly justify, and a private organization collected the revenue those costs generated, in which host cities built stadiums their economies could not sustain, and populations paid bills. They were never shown before they were agreed to, in which the cameras were reliably pointed toward the spectacle, rather than toward what the spectacle had been built to obscure. That arrangement has been running in its current form for nearly 50 years. The 2026 World Cup will be held jointly by the United States, Canada, and Mexico, with the majority of matches played in existing American NFL and soccer stadiums in Dallas, Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and other cities. Unlike most previous host countries, the United States does not need to build venues from scratch. The existing American stadium infrastructure meets FIFA's requirements. The financial case for 2026 is more defensible than what happened in South Africa, Brazil, Russia, or Qatar, precisely because the infrastructure already exists. But the FIFA commercial structure is identical to what it has always been. The broadcasting rights will flow to FIFA. The sponsorship revenue will flow to FIFA. Host governments will provide security, transportation logistics, and the organizational support that makes the event possible. And the promises about economic benefits will be made, and they will be approximately as reliable as they have always been. 5 billion people will watch the 2026 World Cup. Some of them will watch games played in stadiums their governments funded with money that could have gone somewhere else. None of them will see that calculation in the broadcast. The cameras will be at the stadiums. The story of what the stadiums cost, who decided, who paid, and who profited will receive a coverage share proportional to how interesting stadium financing is compared to championship football, which is to say, very little. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo are still marching in Buenos Aires every Thursday since April 1977. The plaza is a 10-minute walk from the presidential palace. The cameras, on most Thursdays, are elsewhere. In the Mordovia Arena in Saransk, the lights are off. The local club was relegated. The stadium holds 44,000 people, and most nights no one is there. In Manaus, in the Amazon rainforest, the Arena Amazonia stands in a heat that was never designed for football. On match days for the local club, a few hundred people sit in its lower tier. The upper tiers are closed. In Cape Town, the waterfront stadium is beautiful, $4 million a year to keep it that way. The soccer club plays across the city. In Doha, the workers who built the stadiums have mostly gone home, to Nepal, to Bangladesh, to India. The debts some of them carried home are still being paid off. The debts of the ones who did not make it home are being paid by their families. The machine that built all of this is currently accepting bids for future tournaments. And somewhere, right now, a government is calculating whether the spectacle is worth the price. Based on the evidence of the last 50 years, they will almost certainly decide that it is. The cameras will arrive. The games will be played. The bill will come due when the cameras have left. It always does.